Porfirio Diaz. He was a good president. He did a lot of good things, like the peso equal to the dollar, or like the railway, that was a very good thing in that time. But then he became a dictator after he lost against Francisco Madero in the elections of 1910. Of course, it created inequality and extreme poverty in Mexico. So of course it upset Madero, but he was exiled to United States. There in San Antonio, at 6 o'clock in November the 20th, he created the Plan de San Luis, that he made the Mexican population to rebel against Porfirio Diaz government. Then he went to Coahuila to begin the war. Then this movement spread all over the country thanks to the another military groups. Some of the most important military groups besides the Maderists were the Villists, that were led by Pancho Villa, the Zapatists led by Emiliano Zapata, and the Carrancists led by Venustiano Carranza. Then 1 year later, the President Porfirio Diaz quit from the presidency and the rebellion won. Then Madero became president. Victoriano Huerta had struggles with Francisco Madero, so he killed him and his brother in the 10 tragic days. So Victoriano Huerta assumed the presidency. Meanwhile, all that happened, Carranza was heading the Constitutionalists. Later, Carrancists defeat Victoriano Huerta. Years later, they made the Constitution of 1917, and Mexico improved for good with no re-election and a secular system.
Good morning, guys. Today we're gonna learn about the Cristero War, so pay attention. The first 2 years of Plutarco Elias Calles' government were very beneficial for the nation. Calles showed great talent as a statesman, meaning of a statesman, political person with great knowledge and experience in state affairs. He fought against corruption and began to reconstruct the country after the revolution. He built roads, created the Bank of Mexico and the first airline. Calles was aware of the enormous power that the Vatican had in Mexico through the Catholic Church. Therefore, he began the separation of the state from the church. Along with the support of the CROM, Regional Confederation of Mexican Workers, Calles, I wanted to set up a Mexican Catholic Apostolic Church that did not rely on Rome. This announcement caused great discontent among the Mexican clergy. It was at this point that a certain sector of the Mexican population, mostly secular Catholics, demonstrated against the government. The militant Catholics formed the National League for the Defense of Religious Freedom, which soon became a raging battle group through the street during the Cristero War. I am a Catholic woman and I deserve rights. The League united to the cry of the Long Life Christ the King, or Viva Cristo Rey. That is why they are called Cristeros. This religious war resulted in the death of around 200,000 labor unions and peasant organizations. In the Constitution of 1917, workers' rights were protected by the law. Article 123 of the Constitution gave everyone the right to have a decent job and promoted the creation of social labor organizations. The 5-day working week, also called Semana Inglesa, is a work week that goes from Monday to Friday with 2 consecutive days off. This working week was applied and employment contracts starting to be issued. As of 1912, workers have tried to organize and create labor unions to back them up against employer injustice. The first associations of national nature were not established until 1917. In Saltillo, about 100 labor organizations gathered and formed the Regional Confederation of Mexican Workers. Reform. The battle over the land distribution became in colonial times, when haciendas were formed, and during independent Mexico when they became large states or latifundia. One of the ideals of the Mexican Revolution was to divide the land and end the large states. In 1915, Venustiano Carranza issued the Agrarian Law, ordering the restitution of the land to the people. This could give as common land, or ejido, or as a private property. Ejido means piece of land that is worked by a community and whose earnings are distributed among all. The ejido is not a private property and, as such, cannot be sold or transferred. The Constitution of 1917 took this problem into account of the Article 27 was proclaimed. The governments of Obregón and Calles did not intend to divide the land. It wasn't until Lázaro Cárdenas became president that a profound reform took place based on ejidos.
Plutarco Elias Calles finished his presidential term, but he still was very powerful and he kept controlling the government. That was called Maximato. Plutarco Elias Calles chose Lázaro Cárdenas del Río to be president, but Lázaro Cárdenas wanted to break the Maximato. To break it, Lázaro Cárdenas created the Mexican Revolutionary Party. At the same time, he created the Confederation of Workers of Mexico and the National Peasant Confederation, so the Maximato was broken and Plutarco Elias Calles was exiled. Then Lázaro Cárdenas expropriated the oil, so this period was called Cardenalism.
Mexico towards an industrialized economy. The economy of Mexico from colonial times focused on exporting raw materials like silver, but in 1929, with poor harvest and the global crisis, Mexico had a change. Mexico began industrializing, and this process was called importation substitution. The rapid pace of the Mexican economy from 1940 to 1952 was known as the Mexican Miracle. This was due for the war economy, in which countries that participated in the Second World War, like USA, bought products of Mexico such as paper, cement, steel, and most important, oil. Two problems faced Mexico. Mexico was financially debt by international loans. This caused farmers to migrate to important cities of Mexico, United States, and entering the Bracero program in USA, in which we got affected.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the population in Mexico was very decimated because of the wars and famine that had plagued the country throughout the previous century. The crisis in the countryside and rural poverty caused large migratory movements towards cities. The rate of urbanization increased as of 1940. For the first time in Mexico's history, a mostly rural population was living behind a predominantly agricultural country. Cities had opportunities that rural areas did not. The problem was that the cities grew disproportionately and opportunities to find a job and a decent housing were diminishing as more people arrived. A few months before the 1968 Olympic Games opening in Mexico City, the world's eyes were already on the country. A student movement had broken out a few months before when the riot police had cleared vocational schools number 2 and number 5 after a conflict that began with a football match. Students gathered at La Plaza de las Tres Culturas to protest, but Gustavo Díaz Ordaz's government radically ended this movement with the massacre. Armed groups in different regions of the territory confronted the Mexican army between years 1965 and 1980. Inspired by the socialist and communist movements that erupted around the world at that time, mainly by the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara, these guerrilla groups were attempting to destabilize the government. In 1952, there were several manifestations of female empowerment, the first of which was for the right to vote. They demanded that President Adolfo Ruiz Cortines create an initiative to reform Article 34 of the Constitution that would consider women full citizens with the right to vote and to be elected to the office. In 1974, they got the fundamental principle of legal equality between men and women.
When the First World War began in 1940, diplomatic relations between Europe and Mexico were interrupted. During this time, Germany tried to prevent Mexico from supporting the United States. But Mexico distanced from both the USA and the European countries. After the war, Mexico tried to have a diplomatic mission in Britain, Spain, and France, but only relations with France were achieved. In 1931, Spain went from a monarchy to a republic, since most Spanish citizens had chosen this form of government. However, there were different political orientation and ideologies that caused a civil war that started on July 18 in the year of 1936. Republicans were supported by Mexico and Soviet Union. Lázaro Cárdenas, that was the president of Mexico at that time, decided to provide assistance to these Republicans. The Second World War started in 1939. At first, Mexico declared its neutrality, but because of its proximity to the United States, its official position was modified. The United States entered to the war, so Mexico needed to support the Americans. In 1942, the diplomatic relations with Italy and Germany were broken. After the World War I, the countries created a League of Nations in order to prevent another war of such magnitude. Mexico was part of that. Then, when the League of Nations couldn't prevent the Second World War, the organization was dissolved. In this place, the United Nations was established in 1945, and Mexico was invited as a member. Mexico was also part of the Organization of American States, established in 1940.
Mexico was changing. It was going from being an agrarian state to an industrialized country. The cities started growing and the population stopped producing goods and had to find them and buy them. In the late 19th century, markets and shops started beginning. When the cities started growing, people's lifestyle changed. They thought going to a different source was inefficient. So in the 50s, the first supermarket emerged, and in 1960, Mexico copied the model of the malls from USA. During the Porfiriato, dozens of kilometers of railways were built, so the country was better connected. Also, during the Porfiriato, the first cars arrived in Mexico. The first company that arrived in Mexico was Ford Motor Company. In 1940, the highway system began expanding. Also, during the 20th century, aviation was encouraged. In 1928, the development of commercial aviation in our country was encouraged. During the 20th century, communication between people began to be more efficient because of the radio and television. Lázaro Cárdenas supported television.